Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I am Dr. Ahmad Wahid Khan. My supervisor is Professor Dr. Saira Afzal. I am presenting critical appraiser using Prisma checklist. Abstract. The current study utilized a strategic search approach based on publishing trend instructional research methodological component research emphasizes and adaptive techniques and technology. During the last one decade, several peer-reviewed articles have addressed two different dimensions of this domain area. However, there is a lack of comprehensive and systematic narrative which can portray a review of studies and literature on this subject. This paper is an attempt to review the existing literature of recent time on adaptive learning technology in higher education. A total of 112 studies on adaptive learning were assessed to characterize the status and identify literature gaps following preferred reporting item for systematic review and meta-analysis Prisma. A systematic search was conducted using a key database to ensure the identification of all relevant articles, documentation of many descriptive criteria such as publishing trend, educational environment, and study technique component was made available. The current study looked at the study focus, adaptive tactics, and adaptive technology. In some studies, the author also looked at the design, development, implementation, and assessment process. The author used content and instructional model as well as adaptive source of to investigate adaptive approaches. The most widely investigated finding of this study, which highlight research gap for adaptive learning, designer and research in the future, will be useful. To discover more about how adaptive learning might help people learn and advance, more study is needed. The lack of literature on adaptive learning and the need to integrate domain expert knowledge and emphasize the necessity of this research. This review adds to the body of theoretical research review in the analytical literature of this domain. While prior theoretical review were restricted to methodological challenges and technique and a relative narrative application of adaptive learning, this study attempted to widen the application area by making use of varied implementation technique and quality assessment of literature and systematic selection and analysis of research study. The title identifies the report as a systematic review. It provides its aim, does not specify inclusion-exclusion criteria, does not mention the names of databases and the date when each was last searched, does not specify the methods used to assess the risk of bias, does not specify the method used to present and synthesize results, does not give total number of included studies and participants, summarizes relevant characteristics of studies, does not give result for main outcomes, does not give the limitation of evidence included, provides a general interpretation of result and important applications. Source funding was not mentioned, registration number also not mentioned. Now, title. Systematic review of adaptive learning technology for learning in higher education. The title identifies the report as a systematic review. Introduction. Adaptive learning is an educational technology, is the kind of scaffolding technique customized to help all stakeholders in an educational institute, teachers, student, and school administrators. For teachers, adaptive learning technologies save teacher time and provide them valuable data about each student level of progress and their capability. Due to scaffolding techniques involved, students receive individualized instruction which help them develop their personal potential in and out of the classroom. Besides, adaptive learning helps students to learn through personalized method based on each student current skills and performance and receive immediate feedback based on each student strength and weaknesses. The current study is only a comparative study across different theoretical and empirical study which aim to familiarize reader with its significance and the maximum variation of its properties. One advantage of reviewing these studies is to learn about the factors that are required for the successful implementation of adaptive learning. These studies in adaptive learning have previously examined how important it is for e-learning system to be flexible so that student can take charge of their learning. Due to this, the focus of these reviews has been on adaptable criteria such as individual difference, personal characteristics, such as learning style, and the effectiveness of adaptive learning. There is also a lack of comprehensive systematic review of studies on adaptive learning. The current study compiled a systematic review of the published article to evaluate first the significance of adaptive learning as seen by critics and expert, and then investigate whether it is an ideally suited to present day university environment. It is hoped that this study will be contribution to the domain of the adaptive learning and offer a more comprehensive systematic approach to its study. The study described the rationale for the review in the context of existing knowledge. It also provided its aim, methods. These studies were classified and aggregate as the recommendation of Cooper and Co. 2012 Prisma prefer reporting atom for systematic review and meta-analysis. In the first step, the problem was formulated about how adaptive learning could be designed, developed, implemented, and assessed in universities. A search chain or query links were created on each database. It was necessary to vary the syntax of each search criterion or query in according with the database. Hence, the series of concepts using the connectors and or result in a very useful search string. The search process was performed on two recognized educational databases for both the primary and secondary studies, namely ERIC and Educational Research for published article between 2015 to 2020 in two phases. During the first phase, the author kept the focus on research in education and its characteristic in the development of adaptation for learning. A blend of specific term was used in the research study taken from the title, abstract and keyword like adaptive learning and adaptive technology in higher learning. Boolean operators, parentheses, and truncation were used whenever appropriate. Synonyms of keywords were also used in some exceptional cases to achieve a more comprehensive search. The English language was the only language that was selected for the literature review. Inclusion exclusion criteria were defined for both the phases of the search procedure. The eligibility of article for this review depended on the inclusion and exclusion criteria selected for this study, namely, and the article must fall between 2015 to 2020. The article included were only peer review ones or were reports, dissertations with technical report. The primary focus of the selected article should be on the adaptive learning technology in higher learning, and all articles selected were written in English. Prior to the selection process, the duplicate paper were excluded. The paper published in two journal were with the same title, same author, same study design, sample size, and the same number in text citation or reference with referred to as a duplicate paper were performed. We performed thorough research in identify any such paper and did not include it in our review. The principal author's name was used for reviewing every retrieved research paper for inclusion and exclusion. Moreover, full text were also retrieved from all such authors until a resolution was searched. The paper included in the research were searched. The search in the second phase was also started with the same keywords and same database with time filter January 2019 to April 2020. Journal articles written in English were added as additional filter at this stage. Operational definition of each keyword were also found in the selected article during this phase. The exclusion criteria dealt with the review that did not conduct any systematic search, not peer reviewed, not focused on adaptive learning, not related to adaptive technology, and not published in English. It specified the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the review and how studies were grouped for the synthesis were mentioned. It specified all database, registered website, organization, references list, and other source searched or consulted to identify studies, specify the data when each source was last searched or consulted. It present the full search strategy for all database, register, and website, including any filter and limits used. It specifies the method used to decide whether a study met the inclusion criteria of the review, but how many reviewers screened each record were not clearly mentioned. It does not specify the method used to collect data from report, also not include how many reviewers collected data from each report, or they work independently, and any process for obtaining and confirming data from study investigators not mentioned. Outcome for which data were sought was not mentioned. List of all variables for which data was sought was not mentioned. Any assumption made about any missing or unclear information was also not mentioned. It do not specify the method used to assess risk bias in the included studies, including detail of tools used, but how many reviewers assess each study was not mentioned. It does not specify each outcome and the effect measured used in the synthesis of, or presentation of results. The study describe the processes used to decide which study were eligible. The study also not describe any method required to prepare the data for presentation or synthesis, such as handling of missing summary, statistic, or data conversion. Any method used to tabulate or visually display result of individual study and synthesis was not mentioned. Any method used to synthesis result and provide a national for the choice was not mentioned. Any method used to explore possible cause of heterogeneity among study result was not mentioned. Do not Does not describe any method used to assess risk of bias due to missing result in the synthesis. Any method used to assess certainty in the body of evidence for an outcome was not mentioned. Result a total of 112 articles were found primarily from the selected database. After removing the duplicate, 70 remains to be screened. 23 and 10 articles were excluded after title screening and abstract screening, respectively. Finally, 13 articles underwent full text screening and eligibility analysis, after which 10 articles were left for the final analysis. Articles were excluded due to the inclusion and exclusion criteria and the aim and the scope of this systematic review. This is a Prisma table. This is a summary table of the included studies. The result of the search and selection process, from the number of record identified in the search to the number of studies included in the review, a flow diagram is present. Cite studies that appear to meet the inclusion criteria was mentioned, which were excluded, and why they were excluded explained. Cite for each included study and its characteristics were present. Present assessment of risk of bias for each included study was not mentioned. All outcome were not present for each study. Summary statistic for each group were not present. The effect of estimate and its precision were not also present. Used of structure table was present. For each synthesis, the study briefly not summarize the characteristic and risk of bias among contributing studies not mentioned. Present result of all statistical synthesis conducted were not mentioned. Present result of all investigations of possible causes of heterogeneity among the study result was not mentioned. Present result of all sensitivity analysis conducted to assess the synthesis result was not mentioned. Present assessment of risk of bias due to missing result for each synthesis assessed was not mentioned. Present assessment of certainty in the body of evidence for each outcome assessed was not mentioned. Discussion: the study analyzed 112 empirical research published between 2015 to 2020. These articles helped in the identification of current trends and behavior in the adaptive learning, especially in research for education. The study by Yaxel et al. Indicated emerging publication pattern and instructional setting in a variety of formal and informal learning situation. According to these findings, educational researchers are increasingly focusing on adaptive learning, which includes studying the demand of adaptive system, studying learning characteristics, creating adaptive learning system, putting them into practice, and evaluating them. This analysis find that adaptive learning studies are increasing, but there is need for further research in a variety of educational environment. It was found that a large number of studies were carried out in a higher education institute, with Taiwan and the United States coming in second and third place respectively. There are few limitations to conduct a systematic review of this nature. For instance, it was difficult to extrapolate the result directly of such experimental studies due to skill and instrument deficiency. Though 10 research papers were reviewed systematically in a view of study objective simultaneous characteristics in each one of them were not present. The variation of the number of included study for all these characteristics were different. However, despite these limitations, this study will serve as a good source of reference for funding relevant studies and building a point of view on silver nanoparticles and their application in preventing the biofilm formation. The study provides a general intuition of a result in the context of other evidence. The study discussed its limitation of the evidence included in the review. It discussed the limitation of the review. It also discussed the implication of result for practice, policy, and future research. Other information: a study does not provide registration information for the review. It does not describe and explain any amendment to information provided at the registration or in the protocol. It does not describe the source of financial support. The study does not declare any competing interest of review author. Report. Achha. Strength: provide a rational, it provides its aim, it specify the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the review and how studies were grouped for the synthesis were mentioned. It also specify all databases, registered website, organization, references list, and other sources are consulted to identify the study. It specify the date when each source were lost last search. It present the full search strategy for all database registered website, including any filter limit. The study discussed its limitation of the evidence included in the review. It also discussed the limitation of the review. It also discussed implication of the result for practice, policy, and future research. Weakness: it does not specify the method used to collect data from report. Also not include how many were collected data from each report, or they work independently. Any process for obtaining or confirming data from study investigator not mentioned. List of all variable for which the study was sought was not mentioned. It do not specify the method used to assess risk of bias in the included study. The study also not describe any method required to prepare the data for presentation or synthesis, such as handling of missing summary statistic or data conversion. For each synthesis, the study briefly not mentioned summarize the characteristic risk of bias among contributed study was not mentioned. Result of all statistic synthesis conducted were not mentioned. Results of all investigation of possible cause of heterogeneity among the study result was not mentioned. Assessment of risk by due to missing result was not mentioned. Assessment of certainty in the body of evidence for each outcome assessed were also not mentioned. Thank you.